Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into some serious political strategy.
Okay.
You know, the kind of stuff that could really reshape the country. We're going to be looking at a document called Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise.
Okay.
And let me tell you, this is a blueprint for what the Heritage Foundation, a pretty big name in conservative circles, wants the next conservative president to focus on.
It's fascinating how this 2023 document actually draws inspiration from a similar one back in 1981, also called Mandate for Leadership.
Oh, wow.
That one heavily influenced the Reagan years and led to some pretty significant policy changes.
Yeah, and here's the kicker. Over 60% of the recommendations in that 1981 document actually became policy under Reagan.
Wow.
So this new blueprint, it's not just some think tank daydreaming. It's got real potential to shake things up.
Absolutely. And it covers a ton of ground. We're talking everything from the economy and national security to hot-button social and cultural issues. They even have specific strategies for what they call rescuing America's kids and reclaiming our culture.
Okay, so let's dive into that rescuing America's kids part, because it gets right to the heart of how this document sees the political landscape. They basically paint a picture of America in decline.
Right.
Driven by what they call the political establishment and the cultural elite. Sounds a bit like a throwback to the 80s, right?
It definitely echoes that sense of urgency we heard back then.
Yeah.
There's this underlying idea that traditional values and institutions are under attack, and that a strong conservative leader is needed to set things right.
So how do they propose to do that? Specifically, how do they want to tackle what they call the family crisis? They're not just talking about the usual policy tweaks like tax breaks for married couples. This document goes way further, arguing for using federal power to actually strengthen families.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. They're suggesting using things like the tax code and federal programs to incentivize marriage and having kids.
Wow.
It's a pretty big departure from the government stay out of my life approach we often hear from conservatives.
Big time. And speaking of big government, they also want to completely overhaul the federal bureaucracy, which they see as this bloated monster holding America back.
What's striking is how bold some of their proposals are. Like, they actually suggest splitting up oversight roles within the Office of Management and Budget.
Okay.
You know, the folks who manage the government's money, they want to give politicians more direct control over how policies are implemented. It's a pretty radical idea.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. They've got super specific recommendations for almost every single federal department and agency. It's like a playbook, a step-by-step guide for a conservative administration.
Exactly. They've really thought this through, from national security to education reform.
Okay.
Speaking of which, maybe we should jump into some of those specific areas.
Yeah.
Because they get pretty granular.
Let's do it. And I think a good place to start is national security, because this document makes it crystal clear. China is public enemy number one.
Absolutely. They're painting a picture of a world where China's military and economic power is skyrocketing. And the U.S. needs to get serious about countering that threat.
So they're calling for things like increasing defense spending, bulking up our alliances. And this one's really interesting. Making sure we're producing essential defense equipment right here in America. They even mentioned using the Build America, Buy America Act to make that happen.
That focus on bringing back manufacturing jobs is key. Remember those supply chain nightmares during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah.
This document sees relying on other countries for crucial stuff as a major vulnerability.
Right. And it's not just about making tanks and planes here. They also want to completely revamp the Department of Homeland Security with a laser focus on immigration.
They're calling for a total shift in how we approach immigration, basically arguing that we need to get back to the basics of screening and vetting people. They want to reverse a lot of recent policies that they see as creating open borders, which is a term you hear a lot in conservative circles.
Yep. It's clear they want much stricter controls on who gets in. And that desire for stricter control extends to the State Department and how it handles treaties and international agreements.
It's fascinating how they propose putting all ongoing treaty negotiations on hold until they can be assessed against the next president's foreign policy vision.
Wow.
They essentially want to hit the pause button on everything and reevaluate it from scratch.
It's like they're saying, let's rethink all our commitments and make sure they align with our America First agenda.
And speaking of rethinking things, they also have a lot to say about reforming the intelligence community.
They argue that the intelligence agencies have become too politicized, which has eroded public trust. They call for a leadership-led initiative to refocus the intelligence community on new and emerging threats, rather than dwelling on the past. So less looking in the rearview mirror and more anticipating what's coming next. Kind of like what this entire document is trying to do for the conservative movement.
Exactly. It's about setting a new course for the future, one that's grounded in conservative principles, but also adapts to the challenges of a changing world.
Okay, let's shift gears for a minute and talk about what this blueprint has to say about domestic policy. One thing that really caught my eye was their vision for the Department of Agriculture.
They envisioned a conservative USDA that prioritizes efficient food production and gets rid of what they see as unnecessary obstacles. For farmers and ranchers, one interesting detail is their call to reevaluate the Conservation Reserve Program.
Isn't that the program that pays farmers not to farm certain land to protect the environment?
Exactly. They're arguing that with food prices on the rise, it might be time to rethink that approach.
They believe that allowing farmers to cultivate more land could help increase food production and bring those prices down. Makes sense. Now let's talk about education reform. This document puts a lot of emphasis on parental rights and school choice.
Their big idea is to allow families to use federal education dollars to choose between public and private schools. They call this the portability of funds.
So instead of those dollars being tied to a specific school district, parents could take that money to the school that they think is best for their kids, whether it's public, private, or even religious.
That's a pretty big departure from the traditional public school system as we know it. It definitely is.
It's all about giving parents more control over their children's education, a core theme in conservative education policy. Okay, we've talked about national security, agriculture, education. Let's dive into another area where they're advocating for a major shift, energy. They basically want to achieve energy independence by getting the government out of the way, less regulation, fewer subsidies for preferred energy sources, that kind of thing.
Right. They're pushing for a more free market approach to energy. One of the most striking proposals is to completely eliminate the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy.
Wow.
Or if they can't get rid of it entirely, they want to drastically slash its funding.
So they're not just tweaking things around the edges. They want to completely reorient the Department of Energy's priorities. No more focus on renewable energy, more emphasis on traditional sources like oil and gas.
That's a pretty accurate summary. They see government involvement in the energy sector as more of a hindrance than a help.
Okay, before we move on to another policy area, we have to talk about the IRS. I mean, no discussion of a conservative agenda would be complete without mentioning tax reform, right?
Of course not. And this document dedicates a whole section to reforming the IRS, which they see as an agency desperately in need of an overhaul. They want to see improvements in efficiency,
fairness,
and taxpayer protection.
Which sounds good in theory, but overhauling such a massive and complex institution like the IRS, that's a tall order, even for a president with a clear mandate for change.
Absolutely. Reforming the IRS is a challenge that has vexed administrations from both parties for decades. But the authors of this blueprint clearly believe that it's a challenge worth tackling.
Okay, now for something that might surprise you, remember how we talked about how united this document is when it comes to things like China and the family crisis?
Right.
When it comes to trade policy, they actually present two very different viewpoints.
Yeah, it's fascinating how they lay out both sides of the debate. A return to free trade principles, where we get rid of tariffs and embrace the global market, versus using trade policy strategically to boost American manufacturing and push back against what they call China's economic aggression.
So on the one hand, you've got the classic free trade argument, tariffs hurt consumers and distort markets.
But then you've got this other side that says, hold on, tariffs can be a valuable tool to level the playing field and protect American jobs and industries from unfair competition, especially from China.
It's a real debate within the conservative movement, reflecting how the rise of China and the increasingly interconnected global economy have forced everyone to rethink old assumptions about trade.
And what's interesting is that the document doesn't try to pick a winner. It presents both perspectives in a pretty balanced way.
Which is actually kind of refreshing. It shows they're not afraid to grapple with these internal disagreements and acknowledge the complexities of the issue.
It's a far cry from the my way or the highway approach we often see in politics these days.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're just getting started. There are so many more fascinating details and bold proposals in this blueprint for the next conservative president.
We've still got to dive into their recommendations for the Department of the Interior, the FBI, the Department of Labor, and a whole bunch more.
Stay tuned, because things are about to get even more interesting. We'll be back in a flash to uncover more of what this document has to say about the future of America.
You know, one theme we see popping up again and again in this document is this idea of the federal government overreaching, sticking its nose where it doesn't belong. And nowhere is that more apparent than in their proposals for the Department of the Interior.
Yeah, it's like a tug-of-war between conservation and resource development, which has been a hot-button issue in American politics forever. So where do they land on that spectrum?
Well, they definitely come down on the side of expanding access to oil and gas resources on federal lands.
Okay.
Their argument is that this would make America energy independent and create a ton of jobs.
They're not big fans of the Biden administration's approach to energy, are they?
Not really. They claim that Biden's policies have actually made us more reliant on foreign energy sources by putting the brakes on domestic production. In fact, they specifically call for bringing back a bunch of Trump-era policies that encouraged oil and gas leasing on federal lands.
So less emphasis on protecting endangered species and more on drilling, baby drilling.
Pretty much. And remember that controversial move during the Trump administration to relocate the Bureau of Land Management headquarters out west. The Biden administration reversed that. But this report suggests that maybe it wasn't such a bad idea after all.
Their thinking is that putting the decision makers closer to the land they're managing would make them more responsive to the needs of local communities.
Exactly. And they go even further, criticizing what they call junk science being used to justify environmental regulations. They specifically point to the sage grouse, this bird that's been at the center of a lot of conservation efforts.
They're arguing that trying to protect the sage grouse has actually hurt economic development without any real benefit to the bird.
Yeah, they basically say that regulations should be based on solid scientific evidence, not just used as a way to block economic growth. It's a classic conservative argument that we've heard before. The free market versus government overreach.
Right, and that same distrust of big government pops up again in their section on the FBI.
This is where we see that growing skepticism of federal law enforcement agencies. That's become pretty common among some conservatives.
Yeah.
They basically argue that the FBI has become too politicized and has been exceeding its authority in recent years.
So what are some of their specific concerns?
Well, they take issue with the FBI's involvement in investigating things like misinformation and disinformation, arguing that this is a slippery slope that could lead to the suppression of free speech.
Okay.
They also want to prohibit the FBI from investigating Americans who are spreading disinformation, unless those individuals are linked to criminal activity.
It sounds like they want to put some pretty tight constraints on the FBI to make sure they're focused on fighting crime and not getting involved in what they see as political witch hunts.
Exactly. They want to see a more limited and clearly defined role for the FBI, one that prioritizes traditional law enforcement and avoids anything that could be perceived as politically motivated.
Okay.
They also call for more transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to sensitive investigations.
It's a pretty scathing critique, but it reflects that broader concern about government overreach that runs throughout this entire blueprint.
Absolutely. This document is all about reining in what they see as an out-of-control federal government and restoring power to the people, which is a classic conservative theme.
Okay, let's move on to the Department of Labor, because their proposals here really highlight their free market philosophy. They basically want to create a much more flexible labor market, one that gives more power to both workers and employers.
One of their key proposals is to make it easier for businesses to classify workers as independent contractors.
Okay.
Their argument is that this would provide more flexibility and opportunity for everyone.
But critics would say that this could lead to more workers being misclassified and losing out on important benefits and protections.
That's definitely a concern that's been raised. They also want to revisit the joint employer standard, which they argue has been unfairly used to hold businesses liable for the actions of their franchisees or contractors.
They see this as another example of government regulations stifling entrepreneurship and burdening businesses.
Right. And another thing they take issue with is the use of ESG factors in investing decisions.
ESG factor.
ESG stands for environmental, social.
Yes.
And governance.
Okay.
And it's basically about considering a company's social impact and ethical practices alongside its financial performance when making investment decisions.
But this document frames ESG as a form of liberal activism that's being pushed onto businesses, and they want to keep it out of retirement plans, right?
Exactly. They see it as a woke agenda being injected into the financial sector. And they argue that investment decisions should be based purely on financial considerations.
It's interesting how this document touches on so many hot-button issues that are dividing America right now. It's like they're trying to map out not just a conservative political agenda, but a conservative vision for society as a whole.
It's definitely a comprehensive blueprint for how they see the world. And they've got specific recommendations for a whole bunch of other agencies, too.
Like the Federal Aviation Administration, for example. They have some pretty interesting ideas about how to revamp the FAA.
They basically argue that the FAA has become a prime example of bloated, inefficient government bureaucracy that's not keeping up with the times. They want to see it become more streamlined, more innovative, and more responsive to the needs of the aviation industry.
So what are some of their specific proposals? Do they want to privatize it?
Not necessarily privatize it, but they do want to make it more independent.
Okay.
They suggest separating it from the Department of Transportation, or at the very least, separating the Air Traffic Organization, which handles air traffic control from the rest of the FAA.
And they want to change how the FAA is funded.
Yes. They argue that the current system, which relies on annual appropriations from Congress, is too unstable and subject to political interference. They want a more stable and predictable funding mechanism, one that allows the FAA to focus on its core mission of ensuring aviation safety, without having to constantly worry about budget cuts or political pressure.
It sounds like they want the FAA to operate more like a business, right? Adopting a more customer-focused approach and embracing new technologies.
Exactly. They specifically point to the use of digital or remote towers, which are being used in Europe to control multiple airports from a single location. They see that as the kind of innovative technology the FAA should be adopting.
Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about the Department of Veterans Affairs. I have a feeling they have some strong opinions about the VA.
You're right about that. They argue that the VA needs to prioritize providing high-quality care to veterans above all else, even if that means shaking things up and challenging the status quo.
So less bureaucracy, more focus on the needs of veterans.
That's the basic idea. They advocate for a more veteran-centric approach, one that gives veterans more choices and more control over their care. For example, they want to make it easier for veterans to see doctors outside of the VA system if they choose.
And what about disability benefits?
They express concern about how those benefits are managed, arguing that the system needs to be more efficient and less vulnerable to fraud. They even call for an independent audit of the entire VA to identify areas for improvement and make sure taxpayer dollars are being used effectively.
It sounds like they want to see a complete overhaul of the VA from top to bottom.
You could say that. They definitely don't shy away from proposing bold and potentially controversial reforms. And that same willingness to shake things up extends to their recommendations for independent regulatory agencies, like the SEC, and the FTC.
Ah, the alphabet soup of government agencies. I'm guessing they see these agencies as examples of the deep state that conservatives often talk about.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. They argue that these agencies have become too powerful and unaccountable to the American people. They want to see them become more transparent, more accountable to Congress, and more responsive to the needs of the industries they regulate.
Okay, give me some specifics. What kind of reforms are they proposing?
Well, for the FCC, which regulates communications, they suggest revisiting Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act.
Section 230? That's the law that shields online platforms from being sued for what users post on their sites, right?
Exactly. And they argue that those legal protections have allowed big tech companies to censor conservative voices and stifle free speech.
So they want to make it easier to sue social media companies for what people are saying on their platforms.
That's the gist of it.
Yeah.
They also want to ban TikTok, the popular video sharing app owned by a Chinese company. They see it as a national security risk because of its ties to the Chinese government.
Okay, what about the SEC, the agency that regulates the stock market?
They want to see the SEC focus more on protecting investors and less on imposing what they see as unnecessary burdens on businesses. They suggest getting rid of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB, and merging its functions into the SEC.
Okay.
They also want to eliminate the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, arguing that its regulatory functions are redundant.
So basically, they want to streamline the regulatory landscape and make it easier for businesses to operate without what they see as excessive oversight.
Exactly. And when it comes to the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which handles antitrust enforcement and consumer protection. They suggest some pretty radical changes.
Like getting rid of it entirely.
They actually float that idea, yes. Or at the very least, they want to take away its antitrust enforcement powers and give them to the Department of Justice.
Wow. And they're not big fans of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau either, the CFPB.
Not at all. They see it as an unaccountable bureaucracy that's been used to unfairly target financial institutions. They believe that consumer protection should be handled by existing agencies like the FTC, not by a separate and powerful entity like the CFPB.
Okay, so basically they want to dismantle a lot of the regulatory structures that have been put in place over the past few decades, especially those that were created during the Obama administration.
You could say that. They see those structures as part of the problem, not the solution.
It's pretty clear that this document is not just about tweaking a few policies here and there. It's about fundamentally changing the way the federal government operates and reasserting conservative values across the board.
It's a bold vision, and it's one that's sure to generate a lot of debate and discussion, both within the conservative movement and in American society as a whole.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, from national security and energy to education and the regulatory state.
But we're not done yet. This document also dives deep into healthcare, criminal justice reform, and a bunch of other hot-button issues.
So buckle up, because we're about to go even deeper into this fascinating blueprint for the next conservative president. Okay, we've unpacked a lot about how this blueprint wants to reshape the government, from the Department of Interior to the IRS.
Right.
But what about healthcare? It's always a huge issue in American politics. What's their take?
Well, it's no surprise they want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, a.k.a. Obamacare.
Okay.
They see it as a government overreach. That has driven up costs and reduced choices for patients.
So what's their alternative? A return to the pre-Obamacare days?
Not exactly. They advocate for a more market-based approach.
Okay.
One that empowers individuals and families to make their own healthcare decisions.
So what kind of things are they proposing?
They propose things like expanding health savings accounts, allowing people to buy insurance across state lines, and promoting price transparency.
So basically, they want to inject more free market competition into the healthcare system, hoping that will drive down costs and improve quality. But what about people who can't afford insurance, even with these changes?
That's a key question. They do acknowledge the need for a safety net,
Okay.
but they want to shift responsibility away from the federal government and more towards states and communities.
Interesting.
They support things like block grants to states for Medicaid and providing tax credits to help people afford insurance.
Sounds like they want to shrink the federal government's role in healthcare and give more power to the states, which is a theme we've seen across a lot of their policy proposals.
Absolutely. It's about shifting the balance of power away from Washington and back towards individuals, families, and local communities. That's a core principle that runs throughout this entire document.
Okay, let's talk about another hot-button issue, criminal justice reform. This has been a topic of intense debate in recent years, with calls for everything from police reform to sentencing reform. What's their take on all this?
Well, they definitely push back against what they see as a soft-on-crime approach.
Okay.
They argue that the criminal justice system should focus on protecting law-abiding citizens and holding criminals accountable.
So are they advocating for harsher punishments and more police on the streets?
Not necessarily. They do support things like increased funding for law enforcement and tougher penalties for certain crimes, but they also acknowledge the need for some reforms.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to things like mandatory minimum sentences.
Yeah.
And the reintegration of former prisoners into society.
So it's not a black and white issue for them. They're trying to strike a balance between law and order.
Right.
And recognizing that the system needs some improvements.
And they also emphasize the importance of personal responsibility and strong families as key factors in reducing crime.
Which brings us back to some of the themes we talked about earlier, like strengthening families and promoting traditional values.
That all seems to tie together, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Their views on criminal justice reform connect back to their views on family, culture, and the role of government.
Yeah.
It's all part of a larger worldview.
And this document does a really good job of laying out that worldview in a clear and comprehensive way. It's like a roadmap for how they want to reshape America, not just through specific policies, but through a shift in values and priorities.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today. From national security and the economy to healthcare and criminal justice reform.
Is there anything else in this blueprint that really stood out to you?
Well, one thing that's worth highlighting is their emphasis on restoring trust in American institutions.
Okay.
They argue that Many institutions, from the government to the media to academia, have become too politicized and out of touch with the values of everyday Americans.
So they're not just focused on policy changes, they're also concerned about a broader cultural shift.
Exactly. They believe that restoring trust in these institutions is essential. For a healthy society and a functioning democracy, they see it as a foundational issue that needs to be addressed alongside all the other policy proposals.
And how do they propose to do that? I mean, restoring trust is a pretty lofty goal.
They suggest a multi-pronged approach, including promoting transparency and accountability, emphasizing ethical leadership, and fostering a greater sense of civic engagement among citizens.
So it's not just about passing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds.
Yeah, they see it as a cultural project, as much as a political one. And that's what makes this document so interesting. It's not just a list of policy recommendations. It's a statement about what they believe America should stand for.
Well, I think this deep dive has given us a lot to chew on. We've explored the Heritage Foundation's vision for the next conservative president, from their approach to foreign policy and the economy, to their ideas about healthcare, education, and the role of government.
We've seen how their proposals are rooted in core conservative principles, like limited government, individual liberty, free markets, and a strong national defense. But we've also seen how their thinking has evolved in response to the challenges of the 21st century, particularly the rise of China and the growing cultural divide in America.
It's been a fascinating journey through the conservative mind, and I think we've all gained a deeper understanding of the forces that are shaping American politics today.
And as always, we want to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as you continue to explore these ideas on your own.
Does this blueprint represent a return to traditional conservative values? Or is it something new? A more assertive and even interventionist approach to governing?
What do you think? Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep